aid for dependent children.
Oh, gotcha.
It was part of Social Security passed in 1935. My father was killed in an auto accident when I was a teenager. So Social Security paid my mother a check each month, aid for helping the kids, right? So the reason I got to go to college, really.
Sounds like a nicer America than we're dealing with now.
Oh, well, we had AFDC until Bill Clinton's welfare reform. And
really?
Absolutely. And they changed it what's called TANF, T-A-N-F, which is temporary aid to families, to needy families. And instead of having AFDC, you have to work. You know, a state can pass a work requirement to get it. It can be no more than 5 years. And so, you know, the single mom who's raising a kid on her own, she can get it as long as she's working. After 5 years, you don't get any more.
Then what?
Go starve.
Right.
So anyway,
yeah.
Longer story, different story. History. It's all history. What we don't know about ourselves is amazing.
That is amazing.
All right. So where were we when we went off on the Kaiser
We did
track?
Kaiser thing. I don't know. We can talk about whatever.
It was benefit plans in healthcare.
Yes, benefit plans.
What was I doing?
Yeah.
And the other half of the story is I also did pension plans, right? I mean, it's ERISA. It's the same law.
Right.
When you go to union trust meetings, it's the same trustees. You know, first you do your pension meeting, then you do your health meeting.
Right.
And then you do your training fund or your apprenticeship fund, right? So I ended up doing those because I've been doing ERISA forever. So for the last...
Because you wrote a paper on ERISA when you were...
In 1975.
1975.
No shit. That's what it all goes back to. It's crazy.
That is crazy.
But it also taught me something. I figured out somewhere pretty early in life, the most important lesson that John Lennon from the Beatles said.
Yeah.
You know, he said, life is what happens while you're making your plans.
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
Are we at that point now where we've got to identify where John Lennon, what he was a part of? My kids I have a 10-year-old and a 7-year-old, and they're poorly educated in that department.
Exactly. Why would they know who the Beatles? Here's
time kills.
Wait, I'll mess with your head in this way. Okay,
go ahead.
The Beatles hit and were big, giganto, 1960s and 70s. That's when John Lennon, that was their heyday.
Right.
1970 is 50 years ago. Okay? 30 plus 20.
Well, I should know that.
Okay? No,
I should know. I was born in 69.
Yeah, but we also don't learn math, right?
Right.
So 50 years ago, the Beatles were big. Now, I transport myself back to when the Beatles were big. When I was there as a college kid in 1970. 50 years before that was 1920. You think I knew any of the musicians who played in 1920?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
So for
but it's the Beatles, man.
Yeah,
I know. It's all in context.
It's Al Jolson and Bix Beiderbecke. How could you not know them? You know,
and everything's so accelerated now, anyway.
Exactly. See, my kids, they're now grown up. They were big on reggae. And my daughter liked, I think it was a garage band, I don't know whether it wasn't funk, garage band punk. Okay.
All right.
Now that stuff is totally passé. That's ancient history, right? We've been through hip hop. Rap is now old business.
I know rap's old.
Hip hop's been around a quarter century.
Ugh.
Now I started listening yesterday because I try to figure out
right.
I listened to something that's huge. There's a New York Times article about it. It's the only reason I would know about it. A 15-year-old here's a beat that she likes.
Uh-huh.
That's the whole idea. Beats makes me crazy. But she hears a beat she likes. She records some words on top of the beat. It's a 1-minute clip. She puts it up on SoundCloud. Millions of people have listened to it, and it's now one of the biggest things on Spotify.
You're kidding. Right off of SoundCloud.
And all it is this hunka chunka, oh, I'm this and I'm that, and I'm here and I'm there, and hunka chunka. And I feel like, wait a minute, I feel like my parents. Is that music?
Yeah. I mean, so what do you listen to? What do you like? Or everything?
Music?
Yeah.
Well, I did radio, so I played a lot of music as a DJ.
So you were just straight DJing it?
No.
Tell me about the radio career.
The radio thing was a little weird. I was, as I told you.
So you're doing ERISA and radio at the same time?
Yeah, but what really happened was I was studying to be the historian, right?
Oh, okay.
And it was time to write the thesis.
And where's this at?
UC Berkeley.
Okay. So you're in Berkeley in the 70s?
Exactly. This is actually
early 70s.
This is 1969, 70, 71.
Boy, that's a woolly time to be running around there.
And I was running around. And I wore movement, student movement, and a draft movement.
That was a year. I mean, if there, there was a lot happening.
Yes. Third World Liberation Front at SF State. One of my partners, Stu Weinberg, ended up representing and defending Black Panthers and students.
Yeah. I mean, you had it all going.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It was crazy times. Because not only did I have, going to school, plus the anti-war movement and running the streets and being all involved in those politics, there was also the whole hippie thing to do. So I was a graduate student at UC Berkeley in history, living in a hippie commune in the coastal range outside of Vacaville, commuting back and forth. I mean, we can get really crazy.
Oh, right
crazy.
on.
It was.
Okay, so anyway, so you're doing radio.
Anyway,
but the context is important, because there was a lot happening.
Well, see, everything was crazy at that point.
Yeah.
And I was saying John Lennon's line is life is what happens while you're making your plans. So, this is a perfect example of it. I'm studying history, and it's summertime, and I say, okay, I have to develop. The first thing you do is develop what is your thesis going to be, and I know by the fall I have to do this presentation. I spent the summer studying. Here's what I want to think about. Here's what other people have written about it. It's this whole presentation to your thesis committee to say, is this okay to make my thesis on? So I'm going to the library. Maybe the first or second week of the summer, I did 5 days a week. Somewhere early in the summer, I'm walking down Shattuck Avenue in downtown Berkeley, and I see a door, and it says on it KPFA. And I was just going batshit in the library. It was just too much.
Right.
So I've always listened to it. I want to see what a radio station looks like. So I banged on the door. Somebody buzzed me in. I went up. And she said, what do you want? I said, well, I just came to visit. And KPFA, they said, yeah, sure, go visit. And I wandered around. And some guy came up to me, and he said, what are you doing here? And I said, I'm just visiting. I asked him who he was. He said, I'm Joe Belden, the news director. And I have no idea why I said this. Okay, this is where life just happens.
Yeah.
I said, Joe, would you teach me how to do radio news? And he said, yeah, sure, kid. Well, tell me, what are you about? And I'm a grad student, blah, blah, blah. He says, okay, what do you want to do? I said, well, I'm going to come in. How about one afternoon a week? And you'll teach me how to do this. By the end of the summer, I tried to spend one afternoon a week in the library. And I lived at KPFA.
Wow, 94.1, I think.
94.1 in Berkeley, 89.3 in Berkeley, and 88.1 in Fresno, all of Northern California.
And it's been the same.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And what happened there was I did radio news. I ended up leaving grad school with my master's. Became news director, program director, acting manager, kind of held every position there for, a year, 2 years, just doing radio full time. And then I got freaked. I got real anxious. I'm like, 25 or so.
Right.
And I say, oh my God, I can't make a living doing this.
Yeah, that's the hard part.
I'm a working class kid, right? And so what comes first is you got to make a living.
Work, money. Yeah.
I mean, if you come from a very solid, well-established background, you can say, okay, I'm going to follow my dream. We didn't follow our dream.
I know, follow your dream.
We followed the dollar, How am I going to make a living? So
figured like 10% of people get to follow their dreams.
Maybe.
That's awful.
Yeah, exactly. That's what's real.
Right.
So I ended up going back to law school. I'd gone to law school the first time at Yale and dropped out after the first year.
Hey, I just want to jump in for a second and say that, first of all, thank you for listening. And second of all, if you could review us on iTunes or Google Podcasts, it would be a huge help. Anyway, back to Bill and Yale Law.
And then I came back to Bolton.
What happened in Yale?
I think the short story is I came out of Madison. I've grown up in Cleveland, Ohio. Blue-collar industrial kid.
Right. Cleveland, that's as blue as it gets.
And I didn't know any lawyers. There were no lawyers in my family. I'd never known a lawyer. I went to Madison, University of Wisconsin, in its heyday, student movement. Again, that's where I really started to run in the streets and get wild.
Wow.
And I applied for a bunch of grad degrees in history, actually. Harvard and Columbia and Berkeley, and because I had done well in college because I had a school teacher mom who always jammed on me, right? So this is, again, life happens while you're making plans. My whole plan is I'm going to be a historian. I'm going to grad school in history. I had studied history in England on a junior year abroad. It was very exciting. I was going to write the history of the working class in America. It would be like the English historian, whose name is E.P. Thompson, I studied with. He'd write The Making of the English Working Class. I had this whole plan. And somebody one night in the house I lived with, 5 other guys in an old frame house in Madison. I don't know who did it, but somebody was going to take the LSAT to go to law school. And I was an arrogant, pompous prick. Sorry.
No.
Listen, I was full of myself. Let's put it that way. Okay. And I said, oh, hell, the LSAT. I could pound it and go to Yale law school if I wanted. And somebody threw money on the table.
Yeah, that happens a lot around those conversations.
Stupid. And I said, okay, you're on. So I did all my applications in history, but I also took the LSAT, applied to Yale Law School.
On a bet.
Exactly. It was just to show them I could do it, by God. And Yale, those fools let me in.
Well, you shut that guy up.
So what? I don't even know who it was, and I don't know if I ever collected the money.
Right.
But and to get into Yale, you had to write an essay. My essay was on Bob Dylan as the icon of my generation. Go figure, get into law school on that. But I then went to my history professors, and Wisconsin had a magnificent department at that time. And each one I said, look, I've been admitted to Columbia and Harvard, Berkeley in history, but I also got into Yale Law School. And I regret to this day, each of these historians said, oh my God, you got into Yale Law School. That's where the people who run the world, that's where people who make history go. You should go. So okay.
So everybody ran you that way.
And my father was dead, right? And my mother, she's elementary school teacher. So these were my counselors, my mentors.
Right.
So I went off to Yale. I hated law. I hated law school in the beginning because I know here's when I went to law.
We're 45 years later in your law career.
Yeah. I've been a lawyer for 45 years and loved it all. I love practicing law, so I still do it. But at that time, here's what you have to get about me. I'm going to the first days of classes, and they're talking about plaintiffs and defendants. And I have to say to myself, every time somebody says that, okay, plaintiff is the one who complains, defendant is the one who defends. So plaintiff goes first, and then the defendant. That's what I knew about the law. Nothing. So that was part of it. It was a real struggle for a kid who'd always gotten A's. Right. But I said, okay, I can conquer this, and I really dug in.
So you're like Michael Jordan playing baseball.
Well, except
you've been playing, right?
Yeah,
it just wasn't your focus. Or your study.
No, I learned how to play.
Right.
I mean, I did real well. I actually, because I had been a student.
Clearly now.
I knew how to. No, but I mean, I knew how to study. I took my exams. I passed my exams. I did that part. But here's the part that really didn't work for me. As I was saying, I was a blue collar kid. I came out of Cleveland, Ohio. I walked into a place where really.
Well, culturally, it had to be a shock.
I'll tell you a few stories. Anecdotes tell the story.
Right.
The dining hall is like an old English dining hall with big oak tables and lots of oak carving.
I'm thinking like Hogwarts.
Windows. Exactly. Okay. That's what the dining hall is like. And I go in, and way in the back, you go through this cafeteria line to get your food. But at the front, when you walk in, there's a little sign where they put in little letters every day to tell you what's on the menu. And I came there one day for lunch, and it said prime rib. And I said, oh, all right. And I go through the line, and she says, what would you like? I said, I'd like the prime rib. And she gives me a slice of meat. And I said, no, ma'am, I want the prime ribs. And she looked at me, and she smiled. I still remember, because I'd said prime ribs.
Right.
She was an African-American woman. She smiled at me, and she said, oh, honey, that's prime rib. That's different from ribs. That's how I found out what prime rib was, okay?
Right.
I'm sitting in the dining hall another day, just alone, eating lunch, and God knows what I was reading, some case book. Guy comes up and he sits down to me and says, you Bill Sokol? I say, yeah, how'd you know? He said, you're from Ohio, aren't you? I said, yeah. He said, we're going to be running across each other the rest of our lives. We ought to get to know each other. I don't know what's happened. I said, oh, okay.
Just some guy.
He says, my name's Bob Taft IV. It's the Taft family. It's William Howard Taft, the former president of the United States. This guy who's talking to me eventually became the Secretary of the Navy. Okay? So I was in way over my head in terms of class. And I'd come out of the student movement. It's still happening like crazy out in Berkeley and in Madison, in Cambridge.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting in this rarefied atmosphere of these people are going to,
Would you call it a bubble? I mean, it was for those times.
It was really a bubble.
Right.
I mean, and it was a bubble of, I can look back now and say, oh, that was class privilege. What a lovely thing. But for me at that time, it was a terrible experience. So I worked hard. I just buried my head in my books. But here's another little anecdote. I take a final exam. I had this one professor I really loved. His name was John Hart Ely. He taught constitutional law in a little seminar. We had wonderful snicker snacks about constitutional law. He had been Earl Warren's clerk, so he was really